Off the coast of southern Africa lies a shoreline that has claimed countless ships. In 1552, a large Portuguese ship named the San Juan catastrophically struck a reef here, breaking apart in the surf. More than 600 people washed ashore with nothing but scraps of food and barely any fresh water. They were stranded thousands of kilometers from home, and they faced an impossible choice: stay and starve, or march north along a treacherous coastline. What followed was a brutal attempt to survive, one that would tear families apart and push people beyond any limit they could imagine. This is the story of the São João shipwreck. Forgive me throughout the episode as I probably butcher the pronunciation of the ship in Portuguese, the São João, which in English roughly translates to the San Juan or St. John. So with that, let's move forward. The São João left Cochin, India on the 3rd of February 1552, under the command of Captain Manuel de Souza Sepúlveda. She was one of the largest Portuguese carracks of her age, nearly 900 tons, and she carried not just cargo, but an entire community. More than 600 people, including sailors, merchants, servants, and captives. Among them was Sepúlveda's own family, his wife Dona Lenore, and their 2 young children, hoping to simply make it back safely. The mission had been to bring back prize goods to Portugal. The holds were crammed with barrels of pepper, crates of porcelain, bales of silk, and stones of great value. The ship was significantly overloaded. Space that should have been set aside for fresh water and provisions for hundreds of people ended up being taken by goods that were meant for profit. The ship was riding dangerously low, and her timbers groaned under the strain. Every captain knew the dangers of overloading, but caution had been pushed aside by ambition. As they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, storms tore through the sails. Rigging was split, and everybody grew uneasy. The vessel had survived the passage, but not without scars. But Sepúlveda pressed forward, determined to bring his family and the ship's fortune home. On the 8th of June 1552, lookouts on the ship cried land. Out of the mist rose a jagged line of cliffs, and down below, waves could be seen violently breaking on the reefs. To wary passengers, it was actually a reassuring sight, proof that they were still on course after weeks of storms. But for the sailors, it carried no comfort. This coast was infamous. It was a trap of hidden reefs and storms that could break a ship in half. If your navigation wasn't perfectly on course, it was easy to stray near the rocks and break into pieces. For 2 weeks, they clawed their way north along this coast. Everyone was uneasy because the ship was riding so low. Every wave that they would hit would actually force water over the gunwales. The timbers would creak under the weight of the cargo in a way that the crew began to worry about. On the 24th of June, the ocean began to swell. A gale roared from the east, driving walls of water against the ship. Their anchors dragged helplessly across the seabed as the gale drove her broadside to the waves. Then came the final blow. The vessel struck a reef with such a force that her keel broke. The ship's backbone gave way, splitting the hull apart. The impact was catastrophic. When the hull split apart, planks were torn away with such force that it flung bodies overboard. There was barrels of goods toppling all over, and in that initial impact, more than 100 people died within minutes. Unfortunately, some of them were passengers who were simply just trapped below deck, or some of the captives who were actually chained in the hold. And to make things worse, there was also children who literally died in their parents' arms beneath that ship. And on deck, Captain Sepúlveda tried immediately to rally order, but the storm drowned out his voice. Dona Lenore clutched her children as a wave swept across the deck, literally watching families be thrown into the ocean. Survival at this point was pure instinct. Some leapt into the sea, clinging to wreckage, while others fought each other, literally trying to grab pieces of wood or anything that could float. And through the night, survivors were floating in the sea, clinging to that wreckage. Whether it was broken beams or casks, it was the closest thing to lifeboats that they had. The surf pounded them mercilessly against the reefs, cutting their flesh and tearing clothes to rags. By sheer chance, some of the people were carried through the breakers and washed onto the beach. Others crawled up from the foam on hands and knees, coughing seawater from their lungs. And when daylight came, the scale of the disaster started to reveal itself. Barefoot, half naked and bleeding, more than 500 people staggered along the rocks and sand. Behind them lay the wreck of the São João, completely shattered in pieces. Before them stretched an empty coastline that would offer no food, no fresh water, and certainly no sign of rescue. What awaited them was not safety, but the beginning of an ordeal that would strip them to the core. Slowly, the survivors pulled together in the sand to count the living and the lost, and it didn't take them long to realize that over 100 people were missing. But they knew from this point on, they had to do everything they could to save the rest. Immediately, the survivors began to salvage what they could from the carcass of the ship. There was a few casks of water which they dragged ashore, and some of them were already tainted with salt. There was barrels of flour which had broken open during the wreck, turning the flour into a paste. But at least they had some scraps. Sailcloth and splintered planks were pulled onto the beach to make crude shelters against the wind. Weapons and tools were recovered, things like swords, muskets, and even nails pried from beams. Anything that might help them endure. The treasure on board, like the porcelain and fine stones, washed ashore, but now it was nothing more than useless burdens. The enslaved captives who had survived the wreck were no longer bound. In the wreckage, any of them that had survived had their chains removed. But yet, freedom meant little here. Rank and bondage had collapsed into the same raw struggle for life. For nearly 2 weeks, the 500 survivors lingered here, subsisting on what little fresh water they had or drinking brackish water from the pools in the rocks. They did have a little bit of luck in finding some casks that had rice and a little bit of dried meat, but again, it dwindled very quickly given the amount of people. Each day, the captain would look at the supplies to ration up what they could, but notice how quick it was dwindling. It wouldn't be long before they started to either starve or die of dehydration. And on July 7th, the surviving officers gathered with Captain Sepúlveda to hold a council. Lenore and other passengers sat nearby, clutching their children while the arguments arose and fell. The questions were asked: should they risk staying, hoping against reason for rescue, or strike northward towards the only Portuguese settlement in Mozambique? The crew of the ship insisted that remaining meant certain starvation, and the captain agreed. He knew that with the changing of the seasons, there would be less ships and vessels sailing through the area, which meant that they had almost no chance of rescue ahead of them. So he gave his consent to the crew and said that they would leave this beach. And with that, order was immediately imposed. He decided that they would march in columns, and he assigned soldiers in the front and rear to protect the people. In this area, not only was there dangerous wildlife, there was also a chance of running into unfriendly tribes. Families and children would be clustered in the middle, protected from everyone else. Now the columns were formed. Everyone was barefoot and already weak. But there was a spirit of hope and determination among them. This planned march, which began organized, would soon unravel into desperation. The march began on the 7th of July, only 2 weeks after the wreck. At first, it moved with order. 500 people set into columns, with pilots in front, armed men scattered along the edges, and families and children kept safe in the center. Captain Sepúlveda walked with his wife, Dona Lenore, her 2 children by her side, clinging to her. Behind them trailed a mass of survivors, and the first days would pass in silence, broken only by the sound of feet on rock and the crying of children. The coastline here was absolutely unforgiving. There was jagged reefs at low tide, thickets of thorn that would cut your bare legs, and sand dunes so hot they burned the soles of your feet. Food, as we already know, was scarce from the beginning. For fresh water, they relied on the rain, but unfortunately it only fell in brief showers, and they would collect it in sailcloth or scoop it up from depressions in the sand or rock. Many resorted to licking dew-off leaves in the morning, or literally drinking fluid from the shellfish. Well, I can't imagine drinking fluid from shellfish is any worse than eating oysters from an oyster bar. But if this content is going down easier than a slimy, nasty oyster, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with somebody you know. If it's not your thing, that's okay. Maybe we'll catch you next time. Let's move on. Within a week, the losses would begin. Some collapsed of the heat and could not rise, while others lingered for days with swollen tongues and sunken eyes before falling behind, literally abandoned because a column this size could not be stopped. Mothers carried children until they died in their arms. At night, hyenas and jackals would close in, their cries piercing the darkness as they dragged away bodies left unburied. By the second week of the march, the column was already smaller. Dozens had been lost. By the third week of the march, the survivors reached a bank of a wide river. Here, the current was swift as they watched the brown, rolling water sweep by. For people already weak from hunger, it was a deadly obstacle. Crossing afoot meant being swept away, but to remain on the southern bank meant delay, and delay meant starvation or death. It was then at this time, somebody shouted because they saw a figure over a hill. It ended up being a local chief from a tribe who came down to meet them surrounded by his people. They had ran into tribespeople before, but they were met with silence and indifference, and they simply refused to talk to the survivors. But this man offered help. Canoes were brought out, dug from single logs, and rowed across the current. He helped get groups of survivors ferried from bank to bank, including mothers clutching their children, soldiers even with their weapons, and even Sepúlveda and Lenore, though pale and barefoot, were carried across by the tribespeople. For a moment, the column felt reprieve. They felt safety in this group. The river, that had been a barrier to them and could have destroyed them, ended up offering them mercy. Because of these kind people, not only were they able to get fresh water, they were able to continue their journey towards Mozambique. And for the first time in weeks, they had proof that they were not utterly alone. And whispers passed down the column that perhaps survival was possible. But as the march pushed past the bank, the brief kindness of strangers faded quickly against the growing hunger. The tribespeople did offer them food, but was not nearly enough for this amount of people. And as the march pushed on past the river, the brief kindness of strangers faded quickly against the growing hunger in their bellies and the miles of coastline still ahead. Not long after the river crossing, the marchers actually reached another settlement. Here, hope flickered again. Perhaps they would find mercy from the villagers. Now, the tribespeople came forward, and for a time, it looked like there was going to be trade possible. But survivors offered up what little they still carried. Specifically, nails pried from planks and scraps of iron. These were treasured by the local village as they were hard to come by. But as they tried to exchange goods, the villagers demanded more and more. Realizing how vulnerable and weak these people were, they decided they were going to take everything they had. No matter what the survivors offered up to trade with them, the villagers kept demanding more. And now they weren't just demanding trinkets, but their weapons as well. Muskets, swords, and daggers were all surrendered by the column, desperately hoping that the villagers would give them food and water. But in return, they gave them almost nothing. A few people did receive scraps of grain, but most got nothing at all. And then the humiliation would deepen. Now in their weak and vulnerable state, and stripped of weapon, the column was surrounded and robbed literally of their clothing and left in the bare sun. The villagers, knowing how weak these people were, robbed them of everything they had. They stripped them of weapons, stripped them of clothing, and left them bare in the sun. This defeat literally broke some of the people in the column. And of the more than 500 who began that march in early July, less than 400 now remained. And at this point, the column pressed forward, but it was nothing more than a procession of gaunt figures who were now mostly naked and barefoot. They were not just robbed of their food, but also their dignity and hope. And within only a week after that river crossing and being robbed by the villagers, another 100 people died. So this gives you an idea of how much their decline is really accelerating. Now, at first, Captain Sepúlveda would try to maintain command. He marched at the front, motivating the pilots and motivating the group, calling for order. He urged everyone to keep moving, but hunger was just too much for some. Men who had once obeyed their officers now started to ignore them, thinking only of the next drink of water or the next scrap of food. And this is when the groups began to splinter. Some people from the column deserted outright, slipping into the bush in search of food to never be seen again. Others tried to stay behind and stole whatever rations they could from the group. The soldiers who had once carried muskets could no longer enforce order, and unfortunately themselves were as weak and desperate as everyone else. Sepúlveda, though, he pressed on, taking those who would listen with him. But everyone knew his voice no longer carried authority. Rank and privilege had no meaning at this point. What remained could just be called a scattering of individuals, each fighting their own losing battle with exhaustion, and the number of the group shrinking with every mile. At the 6-week mark after the wreck, groups had shrunk down to less than 250 people. The coastline behind the group moving forward was literally littered with corpses. There was unburied bodies rotting in the sun, and it was almost like it was marking the trail behind them. And the wild animals knew this. They were actually following the group around, feeding off the dead people that they would leave behind. And among the barely surviving people still marching forward was Dona Lenore. She trudged barefoot with her skin raw, using every ounce of energy she had left to keep her children moving forward. During the raid that had happened only a week before, she had been stripped of her clothing entirely. And it was said amongst the group that this had broke her. The humiliation that she suffered at the account of those people literally broke her mind. And it said that one day she literally stopped walking, dug a shallow pit in the sand, lowered herself into it to the waist, and she refused to get up again. Around her, the march stumbled on, too weak to stop, too numb to help her, and her two children literally lay beside her, barely able to cry because they're so dehydrated, too little to walk on their own, and eventually their cries went silent, and all three of them became casualties of this march. And heartbreakingly, during this time as everyone's walking past her, too weak to help on their own, or maybe they just didn't care, Sepúlveda was completely unaware of what was happening to Lenore. It's not until word is sent up the column that he finds out that he just lost his wife and children. And it was said that in the days after Lenore died, Captain Sepúlveda became hollow. He once marched at the front, urging the column to hold together, but now he marched silently among the survivors. His wife was gone, his children were gone, and honestly with them, his reason to survive was gone as well. Witnesses recall that Sepúlveda was starting to lose his mind. He would at times slip into the bush, drawn to the voices of his wife and children that only he could hear. Sometimes he would talk to himself, and other times he would just simply stare at the sky, but it was clear to everyone that the weight of the grief had broken his mind. And simply, one morning, when the column awoke to begin marching, Sepúlveda was gone. They never found his body, and no trace of him was ever seen again. Whether he laid himself down to die or vanished into the wilderness, nobody could say. But with Sepúlveda's disappearance, it was the end of their family line. And the march at this point had lost more than just a man. It left the already scattered group to fend for themselves. Without leadership, the decline was immediate. Families were broke apart and friends started to abandon each other. The march no longer had a front or rear, only scattered figures along the coast drifting at their own pace. The attrition quickened, and in the earlier weeks, somebody might have fell every few days. Now there was people dying every hour. Mothers carried the children until the little ones literally died in their arms. The dead were left where they fell in the dunes and thickets or along tidal rocks. Many of these people lost to history, their faces and their names never known. At this point, food was whatever could be scraped from the coast. A crab cracked apart with stones, the limpets literally sucked from the rocks. People would desperately chew on roots of plants until their mouths bled. With no leadership at all, any of the scraps of food or water that was collected ended up being hoarded, or people would steal it from each other. Fights would break out, and the group just kept disintegrating further, and everyone just kind of reverted to a primal state. And by the 8th week, the column had dwindled to under 100 people. Small groups started to splinter off and take their chances in the wilderness, maybe to try and find tribespeople, but one way or the other, they were never seen from again. Those who clung to the coastline walked in silence, gaunt figures moving like ghosts across the sand. It's unclear what was actually driving them anymore, but unbelievably, a core group kept pushing further north. By the 3rd month after the wreck, the march had become a death trail stretching along the North African coast. The survivors are now less than 100 people. They looked more dead than they did alive, with their cracked skin and bleeding feet and eyes that could barely open. Every mile of beach took more lives. And as the weeks dragged on, more and more small groups would break off from the column and head into the wilderness, maybe to find tribespeople, but the one thing we know is that we're never seen from again. Some people fell while they walked, while others laid down in the sand and just died. But what was left of the group walked and walked, silent and driven by something they probably didn't even understand themselves. And then, one day, something impossible appeared. It was the palisades of a Portuguese outpost at Mozambique. It was rising out of the haze. Now, at first, the survivors thought it was a mirage. But as they staggered closer, soldiers came rushing out, horrified at the sight of what approached. These were not sailors or noble passengers anymore. They were literally barefoot skeletons in rags. Some people collapsed immediately at the gates, laying on the ground whispering prayers. Others were brought inside by the horrified soldiers. Out of the 600 people that had set sail on the São João, only 25 people had made it through that march. I can't believe that. How lucky not only to be one of those 25 people, but the fact that 575 people died from this shipwreck. For the survivors, the ordeal is over, but it certainly wasn't a triumph. They had to live of the horror of that march for the rest of their life. For the few who had reached Mozambique, they were sheltered in the Portuguese outposts. Some of the survivors even died while being nursed back to health, their bodies simply too wasted to recover. And this happens sometimes after prolonged starvation, where you get something called refeeding syndrome, where like you feed somebody food and their body can't digest it and it just kind of slowly shuts the system down. It's not a good thing. But yeah, like just getting to safety isn't always mean you're saved. But for those who did endure and did survive, eventually they were able to catch supply ships along the east coast of Africa to return to Portugal. There was no fanfare waiting for these people. They simply disappeared into history and probably never went sailing again. Now, back in Portugal, the wreck had become infamous as the first great loss, especially around the South African coast, and it really became a warning of the dangers of kind of greed. It's said that there's still fragments of the wreck that wash ashore in Port Edward, and there's still fragments of the porcelain and beads that were part of the shipwreck that actually wash ashore on that beach to this day. It's just a story, again, pushing things too far, trying to make money, and also how quickly a group in a survival situation disintegrates once there's no leadership. At the center of that tale, and I can't get it out of my head, is Dona Lenore. It's just this haunting image of her literally sitting in the sand, letting herself die and letting her children die while everybody just walks past her husband completely unaware of what's going on. It's really sinks in my head as something just horrible, and I would hate to think what was running through her mind in the last moments. Anyway, that's the story for this week. I hope to be back again next week. Thanks again for joining in.